The classroom door slid open with a soft hiss, and everyone turned to look at the newcomer standing in the doorway. A young Vorketh male with dark fur and nervous amber eyes that darted around the room searching for an empty seat, but finding only avoidance and fear reflected back at him from the other students who suddenly became very interested in their tablets, or shifted their bags onto empty chairs beside them to block his access, and the herbivorous species actually pulled back into their shells or fluffed their feathers in obvious discomfort at the sight of him. Katie Morrison sat in the third row of her xenobiology class aboard Station Harmony and watched this scene unfold with growing sympathy because she knew exactly what it felt like to be the outsider in a room full of people who had already decided you were dangerous before you even opened your mouth. And humans were still so new to the galactic community that most species either feared them as apex predators from a death world or avoided them entirely out of uncertainty about how to interact with these strange persistence hunters who had climbed to the top of their food chain through sheer stubborn determination. The Vorketh student named Keeper, according to the attendance roster that Professor Velthera had just called, stood frozen in the doorway with his ears pinned back against his skull, in what Katie had learned was a sign of extreme nervousness among his species, and she could see him calculating whether to just leave and skip class rather than face the humiliation of walking down that aisle, past rows of students who clearly did not want him anywhere near them. Katie made a decision in that moment that would change everything, though she had no way of knowing it at the time, and she simply smiled at Keeper without showing her teeth, because bared teeth were a threat display to most galactic species, and she patted the empty seat beside her with a casual gesture that said, "This space is open and you are welcome here." The silence in the classroom became almost painful as every student and even Professor Velthara seemed to hold their breath waiting to see what would happen next, because a human just invited a Vorketh to sit beside her. And these were the two most dangerous predator species in the entire galactic community, at least according to the fearful whispers that echoed through the station corridors late at night when the herbivorous students thought no one was listening. Keeper moved slowly down the aisle with his clawed feet clicking softly on the metal floor, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room as he made his way to Katie's row and carefully settled into the seat beside her, while pulling out his tablet with surprising gentleness as if he was afraid any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment of acceptance. Professor Velthara, who was a centaurian with luminescent skin and 4 delicate arms, blinked all 3 of her eyes in sequence and then nodded slowly in what might have been approval, or perhaps just acknowledgement, before she returned to her lecture about atmospheric composition and nitrogen cycles, though Katie noticed that the professor's voice was slightly warmer than it had been before, as if something important had just happened, that everyone was still trying to process. Katie slid her tablet slightly toward Keeper so he could see her notes from the previous class session, and she whispered quietly that he could catch up using her information if he needed it. And Keeper's amber eyes widened in surprise before he looked at the tablet, and then back at her, and then down at the tablet again, as if he could not quite believe that someone was voluntarily sharing knowledge with him, rather than building walls to keep him at a distance. The lecture continued, and gradually the other students began to focus on their work again, though Katie could feel the occasional glances directed at her and Keeper, as if the other students were watching an experiment unfold and trying to predict whether it would succeed or explode spectacularly in everyone's faces. When Professor Velthara announced that they would be doing group projects on terraforming techniques and that students needed to form teams of 4, there was the usual scramble as friends clustered together and claimed each other as partners, but Katie noticed that no one approached either her or Keeper, which was not surprising, given that humans were still mostly avoided, and Vorketh were actively feared by the majority of species on the station. Professor Velthara solved the problem by assigning groups herself, and she placed Katie and Keeper together, with 2 other humans named Lily Chen and Jake Murphy, who made their way over to Katie's desk with friendly expressions that suggested they at least were not bothered by the idea of working with a Vorketh student. Lily was small and energetic, with short black hair and movements that were quick and precise like a bird hopping from branch to branch, and she immediately started organizing a shared document on her tablet while talking rapidly about atmospheric processors and carbon sequestration, methods that she had been researching in her free time. Jake was tall and lanky with an easy smile that seemed to find everything slightly amusing, including the awkward tension that filled the air whenever Keeper shifted in his seat, or his claws accidentally scratched the surface of his tablet, and Jake simply dropped into a nearby chair and asked Keeper directly what his strengths were, as if it was the most natural question in the world to ask a predator from a species that most students avoided in the hallways. Keeper seemed surprised by the direct question, and his ears lifted slightly from their pinned position as he answered that he specialized in geological analysis, because his pack back home was known for mineral detection, and this was clearly something he was proud of, even though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty, as if he expected them to dismiss his contribution as unimportant. Lily immediately declared that geological analysis was perfect for their project, because they needed someone who understood substrate composition and mineral interactions with various atmospheric conditions, and she added Keeper's name to their team document with the same casual efficiency that she used for everything else. And suddenly Keeper was not just the dangerous predator who needed a seat, but an actual valued member of their team, with specific skills that they genuinely needed. The class period ended, and the 4 students made plans to meet in the library the next day to begin their research, and as they gathered their things, Katie noticed that Keeper's tail had uncurled from its tight defensive position around his feet, and his ears were forward and alert, instead of pinned back in fear or submission. As they walked out of the classroom together, Katie caught sight of a group of older Vorkith students standing across the corridor and watching their group with expressions that she could not quite read, but their body language suggested intense interest and perhaps a hint of disapproval at seeing one of their own walking so casually alongside 3 human students. Keeper saw them too, and his step faltered for just a moment before he straightened his shoulders and kept walking beside the humans, as if making a deliberate choice to continue down this path, even though it clearly went against some unspoken rule about how Vorkith were supposed to behave in mixed company. Professor Velthara watched from her classroom doorway as the 4 students disappeared down the corridor, and she made a note on her tablet with all 4 of her hands moving in a complex dance of recording and analysis, because she understood better than the students themselves that something significant had just occurred in her classroom that day. For the first time in the 347 years since the Vorkith had joined the Galactic Council, one of their young had chosen to sit beside a human, and not just sit in forced proximity because of assigned seating, but actually accept an invitation and then stay to participate in collaborative work with genuine engagement, rather than the careful, distant politeness that characterized most Vorkith interactions with other predator species. Professor Velthara had been teaching at Station Harmony for 6 cycles, and she had seen many attempts at integration between different species, but they usually followed predictable patterns, with prey species clustering together for safety, and predator species maintaining careful territories to avoid triggering fear responses in their classmates. But what she had just witnessed was something new and unexpected and potentially revolutionary if it managed to survive the inevitable pushback from traditionalists on both sides. The station's corridors were filled with students heading to their next classes or toward the cafeteria for lunch, and Katie walked alongside Lily and Jake, with Keeper bringing up the rear of their small group, and she noticed how other students reacted to their presence with herbivorous species, giving them a wider berth than usual, and even some of the other predator species watching with curiosity rather than their usual studied indifference. Katie had been on Station Harmony for 2 months now, and she had grown accustomed to the isolation that came with being human in a galaxy that still had not quite figured out how to categorize her species, because humans were clearly predators, with forward-facing eyes and a history of persistence hunting that had allowed them to exhaust prey over long distances, until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. But humans were also social and cooperative in ways that most predator species were not, and they formed emotional bonds with other species, including herbivores, with an ease that baffled the careful social. The station library was a marvel of engineering, with shelves that floated in concentric rings around a central hub, and students of various species drifted between levels using anti-gravity lifts that created an almost dreamlike atmosphere of gentle movement and whispered conversations that echoed softly through the vast circular space. Katie arrived early and claimed a study pod on the 2nd level that offered enough privacy to work without making the herbivorous students nervous, but not so isolated that it would seem like they were hiding from observation. and she had learned over the past 2 months that managing the comfort levels of other species was a constant balancing act that humans had to perform if they wanted to function in galactic society. Lily appeared moments later, already talking before she even reached the pod about atmospheric processors and case studies she had found about colony establishment on hostile worlds, and Katie accepted the cup of real Earth coffee that Jake brought with him when he arrived a few minutes later. Because human coffee was expensive on the station where most beverages were synthesized to suit alien palates, but Jake had spent 3 credits to get the good stuff, because he said they needed the caffeine for this project. They were reviewing their research notes when Keeper arrived, but he was not alone, and Katie felt her stomach tighten when she saw 3 large adult Vorketh standing behind him with expressions that were difficult to read, but body language that radiated authority and barely contained tension. The largest of the 3 was a female with silver streaks in her dark fur, and she stepped forward with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. And she introduced herself as Shadowcaller, the den mother of Keeper's pack, and she said they needed to speak with a tone that suggested this was not a request, but a statement of fact. Katie stood slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening because she had done enough research on Vorketh culture to know that pack hierarchy was everything to them, and a den mother held authority second only to the pack alpha himself, and challenging that authority, even accidentally, could have serious consequences. Shadowcaller studied Katie with amber eyes that missed nothing, and then she asked directly if Katie understood what it meant that she had accepted Keeper into her space and shared her knowledge, and included him in her pack group, and Katie said simply that Keeper was their teammate and they were doing a project together, as if that explained everything. One of the other Vorketh, a younger male with battle scars across his muzzle, growled that humans did not understand because the Vorketh did not mix with prey species and they kept their distance from other predators, and this was how they survived in a galaxy that feared them, and cooperation between apex predator species was dangerous because it frightened the herbivorous majority even more than solitary predators did. Jake cleared his throat and said with careful respect that they were not asking Keeper to change anything about being Vorketh, but were just asking him to work on a school project, and the scarred male's tail lashed once in agitation at what he clearly saw as a naive statement that missed the deeper implications of what was happening. Shadowcaller held up one hand to silence her companion, and then she asked Katie, Lily, and Jake to explain how they determined hierarchy within their group, because Vorketh pack dynamics required clear dominance structures and submission displays to maintain order. But she had observed the 3 humans working together, and she saw no signs of the traditional dominance behaviors that should govern predator social interactions. Lily blinked in confusion and said they did not have hierarchy because they were friends who just helped each other, and the Vorketh exchanged glances that spoke volumes about how alien this concept was to them, because friendship without power dynamics was apparently something their species had difficulty understanding, or perhaps had forgotten how to practice. Shadowcaller turned to Keeper and asked him directly if the humans had shown him challenge behavior or attempted to establish dominance, and Keeper said no, with his ears flat against his head in submission to his den mother, but his voice steady as he explained that Katie had offered him her notes and they had included him in planning, and when he contributed ideas they had listened to him as if his input had value. Shadowcaller repeated the word listened slowly, as if she was testing how it felt in her mouth. And then she looked back at Katie and asked if Katie was aware that humans were classified as apex persistence hunters who had evolved to pursue prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and Katie said yes. She had heard that classification before. The den mother asked if Katie also knew that Vorketh were ambush hunters who relied on strength and surprise rather than endurance, and Katie said she had read about it in her xenobiology texts, and then Shadowcaller moved closer until she was standing directly in front of Katie, close enough that Katie could smell something like pine and earth on her fur. Shadowcaller asked why Katie had shown kindness to her pup, when by all natural law their 2 species should view each other as competitors, or perhaps even threats. And Katie thought carefully about her answer because she could feel the weight of this moment. Even though she did not fully understand all of its implications, Katie said she had offered Keeper a seat because he needed one, and she had an empty chair, and because being the outsider was lonely, and she knew how that felt from personal experience, and because being a predator did not mean being alone even though the galaxy seemed to think it should. The silence that followed was so profound that Katie could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and even the ambient noise of the library seemed to fade away as Shadowcaller stared at her with an expression that was complex and unreadable. When Shadowcaller finally spoke again, her voice was softer, and she said that 347 years ago, the Vorketh had joined the Galactic Council as the first major predator species to do so, and in that time they had learned that to survive, among prey species they had to make themselves small and unthreatening, and they had to isolate their pups and teach them to suppress their instincts and never show teeth and never run when the urge struck, because two predators together frightened prey more than one alone. Shadowcaller said they had taught their young to be alone as a survival strategy, and her voice carried a weight of sadness that surprised Katie, because she had not expected a den mother to show such vulnerability in front of strangers. The den mother continued and said that humans had arrived in the galactic community and confused everything, because humans were the most dangerous persistence hunters anyone had ever encountered, and they came from a world that made the Vorketh homeworld look gentle by comparison, and they had no natural weapons, so they made their own, and they had no pack structure yet. They formed the most loyal alliances the galaxy had ever seen. Jake asked quietly if that meant humans did not terrify the Vorketh, and Shadowcaller laughed harshly and said, "Oh, humans terrified them, but not in the way the Vorketh had expected, because the scary thing about humans was not their hunting ability or their weapons or their death world origins, but their casual assumption that friendship was normal and natural and available to anyone, regardless of species or dietary requirements." Shadowcaller turned to Keeper and told him to repeat what he had said to her the night before, and Keeper's ears drooped as he said he had told his den mother that for the first time since coming to the station, he did not feel like he had to hide what he was, because Katie had seen his fangs and did not flinch, and Jake made jokes instead of keeping his distance, and Lily spoke to him like he was just another student instead of a threat to be carefully managed. The den mother said that her pup had come home and said he had made friends, and there was something raw in her voice as she asked if the humans understood how long it had been since a Vorketh pup had said those words about their time at a galactic school. The third Vorketh, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward and introduced himself as Stone Speaker, the pack historian, and he said he had studied every integration report since the Vorketh joined the council, and in all that time Vorketh students attended classes and completed assignments and returned home, but they did not form friendships, and they did not join study groups by choice, and they learned to be competent and isolated until now. Katie felt the full weight of what they were hearing settle on her shoulders, and she started to say they had not meant to disrupt anything. But Lily interrupted and finished the sentence by saying they had just treated Keeper like a person instead of a predator or a prey animal, but just a person who needed a place to sit. Shadowcaller nodded slowly and said yes. That simple act had created a complication, because now the pack had to make a decision about whether to pull Keeper away from this dangerous path or allow him to continue walking with humans, despite the risks and the social pressure from other packs who already talked about how Keeper brought shame by sitting with apex predators. Stone Speaker countered that perhaps Keeper was remembering what the Vorketh had forgotten, because before they met the galaxy, they had hunted in packs and lived in communities and raised their young together, but they had changed themselves to fit into a galaxy that feared them while humans were changing the galaxy instead of changing themselves. Word spread through Station Harmony faster than any official communication could have traveled, and by the next morning, every student knew about the human pack that had adopted a Vorketh pup, and the cafeteria, which was usually segregated by dietary requirements and species comfort zones, buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly. Whenever Katie or her friends walked past, Katie noticed the attention immediately when she entered with Lily and Jake, because eyes followed their movement and conversations paused mid-sentence before resuming in hushed tones, and the prey species students seemed even more nervous than usual, while the few other predator species watched with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that might have been calculation. Jake muttered that they were famous now, though, maybe not for species integration specifically, but he would take whatever fame came his way, and Lily advised them to just ignore the stares and get breakfast like normal people. even though her own voice carried a hint of tension that suggested she was also affected by the scrutiny. They found a table in the neutral zone where lighting and seating had been designed to accommodate all species, and Keeper joined them a few minutes later carrying a tray of protein-rich food required by carnivorous species, and he sat down heavily and said quietly that the Pack Council had met the night before. Katie asked what kind of meeting, and Keeper explained that Shadow Caller had defended her decision to the other den mothers, but there was significant disagreement because some packs believed that walking with humans made the Vorketh look weak to the herbivorous species, and that grouping together suggested they could not survive the social environment alone. Lily said that was ridiculous because they were just working on a school project, but Keeper shook his head and said it was more than that now, because the Vorketh had spent centuries proving to the galaxy that they were civilized and controlled and separate from their predatory instincts, but humans did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. Jake finished the thought by saying that humans knew what they were and they did not apologize for it, and Keeper agreed and said that was exactly the problem, because human confidence in their own nature made the Vorketh question whether they had given up something important when they made themselves small to fit into galactic society. Before Katie could respond, a shadow fell across their table, and she looked up to see 5 Vorketh students, all older and larger than Keeper, standing in a semicircle around them, and the leader was the biggest Vorketh student Katie had ever seen, with fur that was deep black and scars marking his muzzle and shoulders and eyes that were cold and calculating. The large Vorketh said his name was Fang Render, and he was prime of the Bloodstone Pack, and he challenged Keeper's choice with a voice that carried across the now completely silent cafeteria, because every student had stopped eating and talking to watch this confrontation unfold. Keeper stood slowly, and his body language immediately shifted into something more formal and defensive, and Katie recognized the posture as one of submission, or at least of acknowledging superior status, and Keeper said carefully that he had permission from his den mother to work with the humans. Fang Render moved closer and asked if Keeper had permission to shame his pack by cowering beside apex predators, or if he had permission to forget that the Vorketh survived through strength and independence, and his tone made it clear he viewed both options as equally disgraceful. Keeper said he was not cowering but learning with his project team, and his voice was steady, though Katie could see his claws extending involuntarily in response to the confrontation, and Fang Render laughed harshly and loud enough to make several herbivorous students flinch. Fang Render said project team as if the words tasted bad in his mouth, and then asked if the humans protected Keeper from the frightened prey species who would not sit near predators, or if Keeper was hiding behind his new human friends, and Katie felt her temper flare, but Jake's hand on her arm stopped her from standing, because this was not their confrontation to control. Keeper said he did not hide but worked and contributed, and was treated as an equal, and there was steel in his voice now that had not been there before. And Fang Render's tail lashed as he said equal with obvious contempt, because Vorketh were not equal to humans or any species, but stood alone. Keeper asked if standing alone, because they were afraid of what might happen if they did not, was really strength, and Katie heard something new in his voice that was not aggression, but genuine curiosity about whether the traditional way was actually the best way. The cafeteria was completely silent now, with every species and every student watching this exchange with intense attention, because this was not just about 2 Vorketh students disagreeing, but about something fundamental in how the Vorketh had adapted to galactic society. Over the past 3 centuries, Fang Render's eyes narrowed, and he asked if Keeper was questioning the wisdom of 300 years of survival. And Keeper said he was questioning whether surviving and living were the same thing. And those words hung in the air like a physical challenge. Fang Render pulled his lips back, showing impressive fangs, and said, if Keeper believed humans offered something worth having, then he should prove it through the trials of understanding, which was a traditional test for pups who questioned pack wisdom and consisted of 3 challenges to prove that their new path had merit. Katie leaned toward Lily and whispered, asking what the trials of understanding were, and Lily whispered back that she had no idea, but this felt very bad, and Katie agreed silently as she watched Keeper's internal struggle play out across his face and body language. Keeper was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between pack tradition and his own emerging sense of self, and Finally, he lifted his head and said he accepted the challenge, and a murmur ran through the cafeteria like wind through grass. Fang Render declared that the first trial would begin at dusk in the communal arena, and told Keeper to come alone so they could see what he had learned from his Apex Predator friends. And then the Bloodstone Pack members turned and left the cafeteria, and slowly noise returned to the space, though it was more subdued than before. Keeper sat down heavily with his ears flat against his skull and said he should not have accepted the challenge. But Katie asked what the trials involved, and Keeper explained they were tests of skill, intelligence, and strength used when young Vorketh questioned pack decisions or wanted to pursue unorthodox paths. Jake asked what happened if someone failed the trials, and Keeper said failure meant being judged too immature to make independent choices, and being assigned a mentor who would control social interactions for the next 3 cycles, which was basically losing autonomy for years. Lily said hotly that was ridiculous because Keeper was not a child. But Keeper explained that by Vorketh standards he was still a pup, and most young Vorketh did not make independent social choices until they were much older. So Shadowcaller giving him permission to work with humans was already highly unusual. Katie asked what the 3 trials usually tested, and Keeper said they varied, but traditionally measured a pup's ability to survive independently through hunting skill, tactical thinking, and physical prowess. And Fang Render, as prime of his pack, would design the trials to be nearly impossible because he wanted to prove that Keeper was dependent on humans. Jake said, firmly, that nothing was impossible and they just needed to think strategically. But Keeper said they could not help because the trials had to be faced alone, and that was the entire point, because Fang Render wanted to prove Keeper was weak, without humans beside him. Katie felt frustration building, but she also understood this was Vorketh culture, and interfering might only prove Fang Render's point, so she said slowly that while Keeper had to face the trials alone, that did not mean they could not help him prepare. Keeper looked up with hope flickering in his amber eyes and asked how they could help, and Katie pulled out her tablet and said they could tell her everything about these trials and then figure out how to approach them strategically. Because humans might not know Vorketh traditions, but they were really good at analyzing problems and finding solutions. Lily nodded enthusiastically and said they had access to the entire station database, so if there was information about past trials they could study patterns. And Jake added with a grin that humans were famous for being stubborn and refusing to lose, so helping Keeper win was basically their specialty. The rest of the morning they barely paid attention to classes and instead researched frantically with Stonespeaker, providing access to records of past trials of understanding, and Lily creating a database of common challenges, while Jake analyzed physical requirements and started planning training exercises. By lunch they had reconvened in their library study pod surrounded by data displays and notes, and Lily said that based on the last 50 cycles of recorded trials, the most common first challenge was a hunting simulation where they would put Keeper in a controlled environment and expect him to track and capture a target within a time limit. Keeper said he was good at tracking, but Fang Render would make it difficult by choosing terrain that disadvantaged him. So Katie said, The second trial materialized around Keeper in layers of light and sound, with 6 holographic opponents representing different species, guarding 3 objectives scattered across a multi-level environment, and the display above the arena showed that Keeper needed to secure at least 2 objectives within 10 minutes without being captured by any opponent. Katie watched the timer begin its countdown, and beside her Lily gripped her seat, while Jake leaned forward with intense focus. And around them the audience held their collective breath because this trial was clearly designed to be nearly impossible for a single young Vorketh facing multiple coordinated opponents. Keeper moved to the edge of the arena and stayed in shadow for 30 seconds without moving, and one of the Bloodstone Pack members commented loudly that he was wasting time. But Stonespeaker tilted his head thoughtfully and said, maybe Keeper was investing time instead, and they should watch the holographic opponents moved in predictable patrol patterns with each one covering specific areas. And Katie could see the problem immediately, because the patrol patterns overlapped in ways that made any direct approach extremely risky, and any gap in coverage would close before Keeper could exploit it. Then Keeper did something unexpected by deliberately triggering a noise alert near the first objective, and gasps rippled through the audience because that seemed like a mistake that would bring opponents running to his location. But Keeper was not at the location where he had triggered the alert, because he had created the distraction, and immediately moved to the second objective, which was now less defended, because 3 opponents had converged on the false alarm, and he secured it quickly with the holographic marker turning green. Fang Render said clever, though his tone suggested he was not pleased about admitting it, and added that 1 objective was not enough to pass the trial. So Keeper needed to continue. Keeper had already moved on. But now the opponents had adjusted their patterns and become more alert and less predictable, because the simulation had learned from his first trick, and the remaining objectives were heavily guarded in response to his tactical approach. Katie saw Keeper pause for only a few seconds before making a decision that seemed completely illogical, as he headed toward the most heavily defended objective, where 3 opponents waited nearby and someone in the audience muttered that he was going to fail. But as Keeper approached, Katie understood his strategy, because the 3rd objective at the far end of the arena had been left with only a single guard, since all the other opponents had converged to defend the threatened position. Keeper did not even try to reach the heavily defended objective, but as soon as the opponents committed resources to intercept him, he reversed direction with incredible speed and sprinted toward the lightly defended 3rd objective. The single guard moved to intercept, but Keeper had already calculated the angles and timing, and he reached the objective with seconds to spare, just as the timer hit the 5-minute mark, and the arena erupted in reactions that ranged from cheers to expressions of disbelief. Shadowcaller announced that the second trial was passed because the pup had demonstrated tactical innovation that combined instinct with strategic thinking, and Keeper returned to center breathing, heavily with his fur slightly ruffled but his eyes bright with confidence. Fang Render stepped forward, and for the first time, Katie saw genuine uncertainty in his posture, because this was not going according to his plan, and Keeper was supposed to fail spectacularly to prove that association with humans made Vorketh pups weak and dependent. Fang Render said the final trial would be different because it was not about hunting or tactics, but about understanding who you are and the arena. Floor cleared of all holograms, leaving only a simple circle marked in light. Fang Render stepped into the circle and gestured for Keeper to join him. And Lily breathed that this was not fair, because Fang Render was so much bigger and stronger, but Jake said slowly that it was not about size because the circle was small, and this was about balance and control, not pure strength. Shadowcaller explained that the final trial was a test of center, where both participants would attempt to force their opponent out of the circle. But this was not mere wrestling, because it was about understanding your own strength and knowing when to press and when to yield, and when to resist and when to redirect. Stone Speaker added that this was the oldest of their trials, dating back to before the Vorketh joined the galaxy, and it tested whether a young Vorketh understood balance within themselves, and Katie began to understand that this was more philosophical than physical. Keeper stepped into the circle facing Fang Render, and the size difference was obvious and intimidating, because Fang Render was nearly twice Keeper's mass, with visible muscle and battle-earned scars that told stories of previous victories. Fang Render said quietly that Keeper had a last chance to yield and admit he was wrong to walk with humans, and they would call this settled. But his words were picked up by the arena's audio system and broadcast to everyone watching. Keeper's ears flicked forward, and he said simply that he was not wrong, and Fang Render said, "Then prove it." And the match began. Fang Render immediately pressed his advantage, using his superior size to force Keeper backward, and it seemed like it would be over in seconds, with the smaller Vorketh being pushed out of the circle by sheer physical superiority. But Keeper did not resist directly, and instead moved with the force by redirecting, rather than opposing. And when Fang Render pushed hard, Keeper stepped aside, letting the larger Vorketh's momentum carry him off balance. Katie recognized the principle immediately and whispered that Keeper was using concepts from human martial arts that they had discussed that afternoon, about how smaller fighters could defeat larger opponents by using leverage and momentum instead of trying to match strength with strength. The match continued, and a pattern emerged where Fang Render had raw power, but Keeper had adaptability, and every time the larger Vorketh tried a direct approach, Keeper found a way to redirect or evade without trying to overpower his opponent, but rather outlasting him. The audience was utterly silent now, watching the dance of force and counterforce within the small circle, and minutes passed with Fang renders, breathing becoming heavier and frustration creeping into his movements because he had expected quick victory. Fang Render snarled and told Keeper to stand still and fight. But Keeper responded calmly, despite his own exertion, and asked why he should. Do that because fighting was not always about confrontation but sometimes about understanding. The words seemed to strike something deep in the arena, and Shadow Caller's ears lifted high, while Stone Speaker leaned forward with intense interest, because Keeper had just articulated something important about Vorketh philosophy that had been lost over centuries of careful adaptation. Fang Render made one final powerful push, committing all his strength to forcing Keeper out of the circle, in a move that would either succeed completely or fail spectacularly. And Keeper did something that would be talked about on Station Harmony for cycles to come by dropping low and getting under Fang Render's center of gravity and using the larger Vorketh's own momentum to lift and redirect him. It was not about strength but about physics and leverage and perfect timing. And Fang Render stumbled with his own force working against him, and his foot touched outside the circle. For a heartbeat, no one moved or breathed, and then Shadow Caller's voice rang out announcing that the third trial was passed, and the arena exploded with students of every species on their feet, either cheering or expressing shock at what they had just witnessed. Katie and Lily and Jake were shouting and hugging each other, and around them the reaction was mixed with some students excited and others confused or concerned. But Katie noticed that several young Vorketh students were standing with their ears forward and eyes bright as if they had just seen something that inspired them. Keeper stood in the center of the arena breathing hard and looking almost surprised at his own success, while Fang Render remained at the edge of the circle staring at his foot that had crossed the line as if he could not quite believe what had happened. Shadow Caller moved to center commanding attention and announced that the trials of understanding were complete and Keeper Darkpaw had proven his judgment, sound through skill and strategy and wisdom, so his choice to walk with humans was validated. Stone Speaker stepped forward and said that a pup had just demonstrated something they believed was lost by combining traditional Vorketh instinct with adaptation learned from another species, and Keeper had not become less Vorketh, but had become more capable. Fang Render slowly rose to his feet with an expression that was complex, mixing shame at losing with confusion and perhaps the beginning of respect, and he said to Keeper that he had fought well, which was the traditional acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. Keeper dipped his head respectfully and said that Fang Render had taught him something important by showing him that he needed to fully understand who he was to truly learn from others, and this response showed maturity that impressed even the Bloodstone Pack members. Shadow Caller addressed the entire arena and said that what happened tonight should be remembered not as a pup defying tradition but as a pup showing them what they might have become if they had been brave enough to truly integrate with the galaxy rather than simply existing beside it. 3 weeks after the trial, Station Harmony had transformed in subtle but significant ways, and the change was not dramatic, with no official policy shifts or formal declarations, but in the cafeteria and library and recreational areas, something new was emerging that could not be ignored by even the most traditional members of the galactic community. Katie noticed it first in the cafeteria, where seating had once been rigidly separated by species and dietary requirements. But now there were mixed tables scattered throughout the space like islands of integration in a sea of tradition, and a Vorketh student named River Walker sat with 2 humans and a Centaurian discussing atmospheric science, while another group combined 3 young Vorketh with 4 humans working on what appeared to be an engineering project. Lily slid into her seat beside Katie and said that integration was spreading because she had counted 8 mixed groups today, compared to only 3 the previous week, and this represented a significant shift in social patterns that would have been unthinkable. Just a month ago, Jake arrived with Keeper, and both of them carried trays, while engaged in an animated discussion about mineral extraction techniques, and the easy companionship between them had become so natural that it was now unremarkable to see a human and Vorketh walking together as friends. Jake said that the teachers were noticing these changes because Professor Velthara had asked if they would be willing to present their project to the station council, since their collaboration model was being studied as a potential framework for integration programs across multiple educational facilities. Keeper's ears flicked with a mixture of pride and embarrassment as he said that Shadowcaller told him the pack councils were divided, with some seeing this as progress, while others saw it as destabilization of established social structures that had kept the peace for centuries. Katie said that change was always destabilizing, and then a new voice agreed with her, and they looked up to see Fang Render standing beside their table with an expression that was serious but not hostile as he asked if he could join them. The request hung in the air for a moment because Fang Render had kept his distance since the trials, while apparently processing what had happened and maintaining his status as prime of the Bloodstone Pack. Katie gestured to an empty seat and said, "Of course." He could join them, and Fang Render settled his considerable bulk onto the station furniture, which creaked slightly under his weight as he set down his tray and looked at each of them in turn before speaking. Fang Render said simply that he had been wrong because he believed isolation protected the Vorketh, and that maintaining distance from other predator species kept them safe from the prey species' fear. But he thought Keeper was weakening himself, and by extension, all Vorketh. Lily asked what had changed his mind, and Fang Render gestured around the cafeteria, explaining that he had watched in the weeks since the trials as 12 young Vorketh formed working relationships with humans, and he had expected disaster with herbivorous species panicking and demanding separation and reinforcing the walls the Vorketh had spent centuries building. Jake guessed that the disaster had not happened, and Fang Render confirmed that instead, something unexpected occurred because the prey species became less afraid of the Vorketh when they saw them working alongside humans and engaging in casual friendship. Fang Render's ears flicked forward as he explained that when Vorketh stood alone, they were threatening and unknown predators, who might be dangerous, but when Vorketh worked alongside humans and showed vulnerability and cooperation, they became people, instead of categories. Katie said slowly that humans humanized the Vorketh, and Fang Render agreed but said it was more than that because humans normalized the Vorketh and normalized themselves in the process. And he looked at Keeper directly and admitted the pup had been right about fighting, not always being about confrontation. Keeper's tail uncurled slightly in relaxation, and he asked about the Bloodstone Pack, and Fang Render admitted they remained cautious but were willing to observe and learn because several younger members had expressed interest in integrated study groups, and he had given permission. With conditions, Katie asked what kind of conditions, and Fang Render said the conditions were that Bloodstone Pack members had to maintain their Vorketh identity and remember who they were, even as they learned new ways of being, because they could not trade isolation for dependence. Fang Render's gaze was steady as he said the humans must understand that Vorketh needed to walk with them as equals, not as students, following teachers or children needing protection. Lily said firmly that they had never wanted anything else because Keeper was their equal and always had been. And Fang Render showed his teeth in what was becoming recognizable as a Vorketh smile and said yes, he could see that now, and that was what made this work. As lunch continued, their conversation drifted to lighter topics, and Fang Render had a surprisingly dry sense of humor, with stories about interpack competitions that had even Keeper laughing, and around them the cafeteria hummed with diverse voices and unexpected friendships. Later that afternoon, their group gathered in the library for their weekly project work session. But today, they were not alone because Shadowcaller had asked to observe along with Stone Speaker and Professor Velthara, who all wanted to document collaborative learning methods. Professor Velthara said, with her forearms gesturing gracefully, that they should not mind the observers who were simply interested in studying their process, and the group should continue, as they normally would. It was strange at first working under observation, but gradually they fell into their familiar rhythm, with Katie presenting botanical research and Jake working through chemical equations, while Lily coordinated and Keeper provided geological analysis, and they debated and questioned each other's assumptions and built on each other's ideas. At one point, Jake made a terrible pun about carbon bonding that had everyone groaning, including the observers and Shadowcallers, ears lifted in what might have been amusement, because even Vorketh den mothers appreciated good humor. Shadowcaller said during a break that what concerned the older packs was not the collaboration itself, but how natural it had become because the 4 students worked as a unit while maintaining their individual strengths. Lily asked if that was not a good thing, and Stone Speaker said it was unprecedented because Vorketh pack dynamics were based on hierarchy and defined roles. But he was watching them work with no dominance displays or submission signals, but just simple cooperation. Katie explained that humans tended to form what they called horizontal relationships, where they had leaders when needed, but preferred collaboration to hierarchy when possible, and this was a fundamental aspect of human social structure. Shadowcaller observed that it worked for humans, but would it work for Vorketh, because their entire social structure was built on pack hierarchy? And if young Vorketh started expecting horizontal relationships, what would happen to traditional structures? It was a genuine question, not a criticism, and Katie appreciated the honesty, because Shadowcaller was trying to understand rather than simply resist. Change, Keeper said slowly, that maybe they did not have to abandon hierarchy entirely, but could have both with pack structure for some things and collaboration for others, because Shadowcaller was still his den mother, and he respected her authority. But with his friends he could be equals. Professor Velthara made a soft sound that might have been approval, and said this was contextual social structures where individuals maintained traditional bonds while developing new types of relationships, and this was fascinating from a sociological perspective. Stone Speaker's typing intensified, as he said this needed to be documented thoroughly because they were describing a hybrid social model that could revolutionize how the galactic community thought about cross-species integration. The observation session ended, but the conversation continued with more Vorketh students gathering near their study pod and watching from a respectful distance, and Katie noticed that humans were not the only ones attracting Vorketh attention anymore, because a few herbivorous students were tentatively approaching the mixed groups. One Avarian student with brilliant blue feathers approached their pod and said her name was Skylar, and she was wondering if it would be acceptable to ask questions. Katie said warmly that of course Skylar could ask questions, and the Avarian asked how they did not feel afraid because her instincts told her to flee from predators, but she saw them all working together, and they seemed comfortable. Keeper answered before Katie could and said it was because they knew him now as Keeper, who was terrible at chemistry and made bad jokes and got excited about rock formations rather than just seeing him as a predator category. Jake snorted and said Keeper's jokes were not that bad, but Lily countered with a grin that they were pretty bad, and this casual teasing made Skylar's feathers ruffle with what seemed to be amusement rather than fear. Skylar asked if they had stopped seeing each other as species categories, and Katie said they started seeing each other as people because Keeper was Vorketh. Yes, but that was just one part of who he was, the same way Katie was human, but also a student and friend and someone who liked botany. Jake added that Katie was also chronically late to morning classes, which Katie admitted was true, and this casual acknowledgement of imperfection seemed to fascinate Skylar.